So the medicines are something that can help many people right now, but I don't think they should be the long-term solution. They should maybe be the long-term solution for some people. But if we don't fix the underlying problem where people can live a balanced and healthy life, but while that is not in place, we do have these medicines that could actually help a lot of people.
GLP-1 receptor agonists, often just now called GLP-1s, are one of the most revolutionary new class of drugs that we have seen in decades. By now, their benefits for weight management, for controlling blood glucose and treating type 2 diabetes, and for improving cardiovascular health overall are widely known, with significant benefits also for the kidney and for liver function, and indeed, every day we learn about new potential applications, from addiction treatment to dementia risk reduction, even improved cancer survivorship. So, what is the story behind these apparent miracle drugs? And for obesity in particular, while it might be a bit dystopian to think of them as the cure for the entire obesity epidemic, they surely can play some major role, but what is that role exactly? I'm Derek Angus, a physician and senior editor at JAMA, and you're listening to Healthy Dialogue. Today, I have the pleasure of speaking with Jens Holst and Lotte Knudsen. They played crucial roles in the discovery and development of GLP-1 receptor agonists. Both Jens and Lotte were guests at the recent JAMA Summit on Obesity, where thought leaders and experts from around the world came to the JAMA offices in Chicago to tackle the rapidly evolving landscape of obesity and metabolic disorders. And today, Jens, Lotte, and I are going to discuss everything from how these drugs came to be, concerns over cost and access, what's coming around the corner, and the potentially massive magnitude of their impact. We're also going to get into whether these drugs represent a true solution to the global obesity epidemic, or if they're just one piece of the puzzle. Thank you so much for joining me, Jens and Lotte. Why don't we start at the beginning? Take me back to the 1970s when this all started.
So what we were doing, we were looking for an incretin hormone. The incretin concept is the idea that the gut somehow stimulates insulin secretion after meals. And that's, of course, important for glucose regulation. So this is of considerable interest. But when we started looking for this, the incretin hormones were not known. So I was simply looking for an incretin hormone. And so there were some cells in the gut that were reacting with antibodies against glucagon. And so I thought these were interesting because it was known that glucagon would stimulate insulin secretion. So this could be one way ahead. And the next many years went by isolating this peptide that was produced in those cells to try to see why they reacted with the antibodies. And it turned out to be a different molecule. It's called glycentrin. It has 69 amino acids. We felt that this might be something important, namely the precursor, the pro-hormone for glucagon. And that's because we could find all the bits and pieces around it in the pancreas as well as in the gut. But the problem was that pro-glucagon had to be bigger than that. It had to be at least twice as large as the glycentrin molecule of 69 amino acids. And we and others were, trying to find what was in the rest of that molecule. But that's when the molecular biologists, they took over, and Graham Bell from Chicago, he isolated the nucleotides. He found glycentrin as one half of the pro-glucagon molecule. But then there were, in addition to glucagon-like stretches, DNA stretches, and there was a glucagon-like sequence 1 and a glucagon-like sequence 2. And that was exactly the information we needed.
Okay, that is rather complex biochemistry. Let me see if, in my own amateur way, I can simplify this a bit. So Jens was trying to hunt down the mechanism for the so-called incretin effect. The incretin effect is the phenomenon where if you eat sugar, take it into your stomach, as opposed to receiving the exact same dose of sugar intravenously injected into your veins, your body makes much more insulin. So that's interesting. Insulin is the hormone that controls how glucose enters the cells, and that's where it's used as our body's primary energy source. So why would we make more insulin for the same amount of glucose if we took it into our stomach rather than if it was bolused into our vein? And how does that happen? The assumption was that there was an intermediate hormone as yet undiscovered somewhere in the gut, for example, in the lining of the stomach, that would be released by the act of eating, and that would in turn stimulate insulin. Jens was hunting for this as yet undiscovered hormone and looking in sort of isolated cells from bits of the gut, from animal models and so on. He found something that looked a bit like another hormone, glucagon, but it was way too big to be glucagon because they knew the size of glucagon, and when they measured and weighed this protein, it was bigger than that. They then thought it might be the so-called prohormone for glucagon, proglucagon. Prohormones are the precursors to hormones, sort of like the large inactive version of a hormone before the body chops some of it up to then make a smaller piece become active. So proglucagon is the larger precursor to glucagon. But the problem was, while the thing he'd found was too big to be glucagon, it was also too small to be proglucagon. In the end, it turned out that there was actually a family of similar looking hormones that were all made from proglucagon, but they were made in different ways by different cells in the gut and the pancreas and so on. Some cells made glucagon, and others made something called glycentin. Others made the now infamous GLP-1 and GLP-2. Glucagon-like peptides, things that looked a bit like glucagon, but they weren't glucagon. They all do different things in the gut and the gastrointestinal system. It's GLP-1 that had the so-called incretin effect. When you took food into your stomach, you made GLP-1, and GLP-1 would then stimulate insulin.
Then I put the GLP-1 on the I had a living pancreas, an isolated perfused pig pancreas, which really could do a lot of insulin secretion. So I put this peptide on it and nothing happened. So I said, no, this can't be. I mean, after all this work, it can't be. So then I decided to isolate the natural peptide, the natural compound. And we could do that with the tools we had then. So we isolated it and purified it and had it sequenced and had it in pure form and could put it on the pancreas. And that worked. So now we had the insulin-releasing peptide from the gut, the GLP-1. So that was the very beginning.
And just to back up a little bit, this wasn't at the time about treating diabetes or obesity, right? I mean, why were you interested in gut hormones?
Diabetes was not something that was on people's mind because you couldn't do anything about it anyway. And people were not obese, so that was also not a problem. No, the real problem was peptic ulcer disease, gastric ulcer disease. That was the real problem. So we were looking also all the time to see if there was any effect of that. And GLP-1 inhibits gastric acid secretion. So this, in that way, it was a success, you can tell. But what we found on our perfused pancreas also was that it also inhibited glucagon secretion. So this was news. This was interesting. This kind of directed the whole thing into the regulation of blood glucose. Even if, it was perhaps not the diabetes, but it was still extremely interesting because people with diabetes, they have problems with insulin and they also have problems with glucagon. There is too much of it and it helps keeping up the blood glucose. So this was actually an interesting observation, and that started, inspirations on ideas that this might, after all, be useful in type 2 diabetes. So slowly we went on to think about that.
Okay, so that's work done through the 70s and 80s. you, Jens, and others like Joel Habner in Boston, you'd made a number of very interesting discoveries. But truth be told, you hadn't really had your moment on the front page of the New York Times at this point, right? So, Lotte, maybe you could pick up this story as we move into the 90s.
So what then happened in the early 90s across the pharma industries was people were getting more and more interested in doing something new for diabetes, because there was a growing realization that more and more people had type 2 diabetes. So, and insulin was being used more and more also for people with type 2 diabetes. So there was a growing realization that we need to do something differently. And at the same time, just a few years later, there was also a growing realization that we have a big problem with obesity. And then there was this interest in GLP-1. And I will almost guarantee you that every single pharma had an effort to make GLP-1 small molecules. And I actually know, because Novo Nordisk had the patent on the GLP-1 receptor, the use patent. So we know how many people were interested in a license, but they didn't succeed, right? And then they were stuck with everyone was stuck with the peptides, right? And then the notion was just that peptides are not medicines. And then if you speak with Svetlana Moisov or Richard DeMarchi, both of them can tell you long stories about how they were mocked for working on peptides because people were just saying peptides are not medicines. People were thinking, proteins are medicines, where, that's insulin or growth hormone or like, and that's nature's. And then small molecules are medicines, but peptides, that was a new modality. People just didn't believe in it, right? So that's how GLP-1 was born out of skepticism from most people. But at the same time, there was just in the mid-90s, there was this focus on obesity arising across the industry. But they had the restrictive thinking that, first of all, peptides cannot be medicine. And peptides certainly cannot be medicines for the treatment of obesity because they cannot impact the brain.
But it turns out that's not the case, right? In fact, the role of GLP-1s in the brain, for example, is pretty important.
Yes, there was a whole separate science coming up around GLP-1 in the brain. And, there's a lot of people who keep saying, it's just a chance finding in people with diabetes and the Gila monster inspired the whole thing. No, it didn't, right? And the Exendin 4 was never tried in people with obesity because it doesn't give much weight loss, right? And dulaglutide, which was Eli Lilly's first once-weekly GLP-1, also never tried in obesity because it doesn't give much weight loss. The reason why it actually ever came to be was because of this early science around GLP-1 that was specifically in obesity. Personally, I was inspired by this group led by Ole Madsen in Copenhagen, with Jens also collaborated with those. Right? They had this animal model that secreted high levels of GLP-1 and also a few other peptides. Right? And those animals, they starved themselves to death. But the big paper that made headline news was in Nature in January 1996 from Stephen Bloom in London. Again, GLP-1 directly into the brain of rats, they would completely stop eating even hungry rats. So those things were around at the time when I was leading the invention of liraglutide. And, I'm just a simple country girl. I was just thinking, if here we are, people talking about this be used for diabetes, other people are saying it could be used for obesity. Why would I not suggest them both at the same time?
Right. So, of course, that's what you did suggest, but what made people think about looking at GLP-1 in the brain and think about looking at GLP-1 in obesity?
There was this gastroenterology angle to the whole thing. The gut was the primary target. And actually, it was known since 1973 that there were hormones from the gut that would inhibit food intake, that would regulate food intake. And the first one was cholecystokinin, and people have been working on that ever since, but with little luck. But so that was on the mind of everybody who was working with gut hormones all the time, that this was something you would have to look for. And the same was true for GLP-1. And so eventually we did that study in people. It's true that Stephen Bloom came up with a paper in in 1996, and he actually presented it already in 93. But that was injections of GLP-1 into the brain. That's a pretty stupid thing to do, because the peptide from the body, the hormone from the gut, never gets there. Never.
It never crosses the blood-brain barrier.
Exactly. So that's, it was good luck, and it had but it opened another complicated and still somewhat of an enigma, that there is GLP-1 produced in the brain. And GLP-1 in the brain has its own receptors in the brain, and some of these receptors will inhibit food intake, but that's actually a different story.
Okay, so there are these several separate and interrelated lines of investigation motivated by people trying to solve different sorts of problems, ranging from trying to solve peptic ulcer disease, trying to wonder about how the gut works, trying to fix obesity, trying to fix diabetes, etc. And then we get to the point that you are now at Novo Nordisk, Lotte, and you think, well, GLP-1 itself doesn't behave well as a drug. It's short-acting, it's unstable, etc. So what light bulbs go off with you to think about, how can I make a drug out of this?
So as a very young, I started working on GLP-1 sort of in 1991 as I call myself the lab rat, setting up assays, doing all the work and endless hours in the lab. And I worked actually on 3 different projects that didn't work before the one that actually did, because we were working together with Pfizer to create sustained release formulation. We tried to stabilize GLP-1 in a simple way. We tried to make small molecule. I'm actually the first author on the very first paper on small molecules, but it didn't work at the time, right? And then after 3 failed attempts, I was giving the project, there was a new head of research. This is Mads Krogsgaard, who is now the CEO of the Novo Nordisk Foundation. And, when he just said to me, you figure it out. He probably thought I never would. But then I was just thinking there, sitting, and I'm an engineer background, right? I come from the technical university. I like to call it Denmark's MIT, right? So I'm trained to solve problems, right? I thought, what can I do, right? And I was looking around, what's available? What do I think I can do? And then there was this technology about fatty acid acylation, which was being tried on insulin at the time. No one knew if it would work or something, but it's just a principle of nature. We have this big transporter molecule in the blood, and one of the things it does is to bind, it's called albumin, right? And one thing that it does is to transport things around for us, including fatty acids, which are not very soluble in blood. It has a lot of capacity for binding a fatty acid. So if you take your peptide potential drug molecule and you put a fatty acid on it, it will bind to albumin, and then albumin will protect it and carry it around in the body. And when I saw this technology that our insulin people were looking at, I thought, I could actually imagine myself doing that. I had some chemistry training, some peptide training. I could do that. Let's go for that, because the alternatives were things that we had already tried and we couldn't really figure out how to optimize. So this was actually the best chance, looking at it from my side. And we were always very focused at that time to say we wanted to make a simple product. So we actually declined exenatide to license it a couple of times because it was too short acting. And it was also unnative to the human body, right? So we were actually concerned about antibodies against the peptide. So we wanted to make a molecule that was very close to human GLP-1, and that we could actually do with this fatty acid acylation technology. So with that, we created liraglutide, and it turned out that it worked really differently from insulin because, insulin is cleared via the liver and the receptor, whereas GLP-1 is cleared via the kidney and with DPP-4 degradation. So it really worked very differently, and we could create actually at the time a very long-acting GLP-1 that covered all of the 24 hours per day. And then, that became the first long-acting GLP-1, the first GLP-1 to be approved for obesity, the first GLP-1 to actually get the cardiovascular label indication. But then, of course, later came semaglutide, which just turned out primarily optimized for duration of efficacy, but it just turned out to give so much more weight loss. And that was what became the revolution in weight loss, right?
A revolution in weight loss for sure. A recent Gallup poll found about 1 in 10 US adults are currently taking GLP-1s. The medications have been shown to be effective in treating a number of conditions in addition to weight loss and diabetes, from cardiovascular health to kidney and liver function. So I asked Jens and Lotte, what is it about these drugs that gives them such far-reaching impact?
That's because it's all built into the GLP-1 biology. There's one GLP-1 receptor, it's expressed on many different cells, and it just turns out in this system, there's no desensitization, sort of like broadly speaking. So, of course, leptin was a big hope for many people in obesity, but it just didn't work in general obesity. But with this biology, there are these specific GLP-1 receptors expressed on different cells. Jens talked about insulin and glucagon and gastric emptying. There's lots of GLP-1 receptors in the brain. It works both on feelings of hunger and satiety, but also on food choice and food noise and food cravings and all of that. It also works on the cardiovascular system, on the kidney. There are specific GLP-1 receptors expressed on many different cell types. And we're just a little bit lucky that it's actually allowed to transform it from a short-acting postprandial signal to long-acting pharmacology, where we give much higher levels than we have in physiology, right? But it all comes with some of the basic biology that Jens was talking about, that this is what GLP-1 was designed to do. But it's not designed in physiology to be very long-acting. There, we've been a little bit lucky that you actually can do that without without any serious side effects.
So ever since the results of the liraglutide cardiovascular outcome trial, the LEADER trial, were published, where there was this very significant effect on cardiovascular risk, people have been trying to find out how was that possible, because it was what predicted. The previous trials with lixisenatide was negative. All the DPP-4 inhibitors that increased GLP-1 secretion, they were also negative. So here comes a LEADER trial, and people could barely believe their own eyes. So people started thinking about this. But today we think that there are three major mechanisms here. And one is, of course, the weight loss, and particularly the great weight losses that we see with semaglutide. There's really no doubt that a major weight loss, but it must be big. It must probably be more than 10% for some time, is effective in solving some of the complications of obesity. But it's not the only explanation, and that is shown in different studies that it cannot be the only explanation. So people have been focusing on two other major sites. One is the vasculature. And so there are numerous indications that there is a receptor expression in the vascular system, and that activation of this receptor can have beneficial effects on processes that are harmful, atherosclerosis and inflammation. And so you have this entire vascular system. And since this is common for all the organs and the brain and everything, you can understand that it can have beneficial actions by improving the circulation at all these sites. And then this last really important mechanism is its effects on inflammation. And that, it turns out that obesity and diabetes are both associated with what we call a low-grade inflammation. And we know this from the study of measurements of all the inflammatory markers that we have in circulation. And it turns out that the GLP-1s, they have a very pronounced effect on the levels of these inflammatory markers. And the interpretation is that this is a major activity of the GLP-1. And, one site where we really have a lot of GLP-1 receptors is in the gut itself, where there are some lymphocytes that sit in the lining of the gut. And they are stuffed with GLP-1 receptors. So the idea is, that you eat and you produce GLP-1, and then they will signal to these lymphocytes that then will pass on the message to the immune system and have an anti-inflammatory action. So those are the main lines why it is possible that it can have so many effects on so many organ systems.
So let's just add to that just briefly for the layman's audience. GLP-1 also lowers blood pressure. GLP-1 also lowers triglycerides and also so there are again the story about GLP-1 is always these multiple mechanisms. So yes, weight loss and glucose lowering will help, but there are also mechanisms that are more specific to the cardiovascular system, like blood pressure, like lipid lowering, like inflammation. And the neuroscience actually speak to that there are these very important population of neurons in the hindbrain. There was a paper last year in Science from Charles Zucker's lab in New York showing that these neurons actually both control both peripheral and central inflammation, and they, of course, have the GLP-1 receptor. But always the story with GLP-1 is that there are multiple mechanisms involved in mediating the outcome.
Okay, so let's take stock. So as we go through life and we age, aging is essentially a pro-inflammatory condition. Inflammation gets you, sort of cardiosclerotic change gets you, etc. You've just listed most of the things other than cancer, maybe even cancer. A lot of cancer is due to underlying inflammation as well. You've listed that these drugs could just about play a beneficial treatment and or preventive role for nearly every blight upon humanity. And so it's a bit like the elixir of life. This could be the drug. That leads me to say, so should everyone be on a GLP-1? I mean, do you think there are legitimate long-term concerns, or do you think it's only upside?
So all medicines have side effects, right? And certainly the GLP-1s also have side effects, right? So there's nausea and vomiting in many people, and there are all kinds of more rare side effects coming up. We went through a long stretch of time where we had to show that thyroid cancer likely wasn't relevant for humans. We had a lot of discussions about pancreatitis and pancreas cancer. So when a class of medicines is used as widely as this one is, there's always going to be rare side effects. But there doesn't appear to be any sort of like really serious and common side effects. That doesn't seem to be there. And when you look at what the regulators have looked at multiple times, which is the benefit-risk ratio, it's always come out positive. And that's even looking at the endpoints one at a time, right? Because one of the things I would like to advocate for, which I also said at the meeting, right, was why couldn't regulators look more actually at the combined effects across tissues, right? But even when looking at them one at a time, the benefit outweighs the risk.
So basically, if you can tolerate the drug, then it's likely that you can just stay on the drug, presuming you don't have difficult side effects with nausea, and you can get it balanced, you're hydrating enough, you've worked out how to take the drug and so on, then you would just be on it for life.
You know, that's what they're approved for, right? It is what the approval goes for. And of course, you know, maybe if you're a very frail elderly patient, maybe that's not the choice, right? There are all this focus on losing muscle mass if you can't exercise or so like but of course I'm not going to sit here and say that it's for everybody and the whole world should be on it. And you know, in the spirit of the JAMA summit that we just attended, we need to fix the underlying problem, because it's not a solution to medicate the whole world, right?
So I think this is one of the benefits of using the naturally occurring hormone as the drug and knowing that it acts on its receptor. So this is a natural system. Everything is natural. And that's probably the explanation why we are not in for bad surprises in the future, because this system does not have any major side effects. There is the biosystem. There is a little bit of an increased frequency of biostones. That's all.
Okay, so let's pivot. They are amazing drugs. I mean, obviously you've been living this for decades, but for those of us in medicine in general, it's hard to. There are, I think, maybe some of the revolution in immunotherapy in cancer has been one of the most amazing things that I've seen in the last few decades. But But this drug class is having as big an effect on its chosen diseases as immunotherapy is having on some cancers. But what's different is that this drug class seems to be doing it in an even wider array of diseases. And it's less expensive and it has less side effects than immunotherapy. So it's really remarkable. It has to be on everyone's short list of maybe the most amazing breakthroughs in all of medicine in the last 30, 40, 50 years. So despite that, though, lots of people who should be on it are not on it. And people who go on it, as we discussed at the summit, amazingly, many don't stay on it. Even though there's data that people like being on it, they have less food noise. I think there's even some data that people who, even if they're not experiencing that much weight loss, they actually like how they feel on the drug and they're happy to stay on the drug. And yet we know most people don't. A lot of it is for issues relating to financing it. Certainly in the United States, it costs too much money and so on. And people are also not all taking the drug in the way that the FDA or the EMA has recommended. There's microdosing, there's people using drugs that aren't even approved yet. So that's one whole thing, is the whole issue of the mismatch between who we think should be getting the drug and who is actually getting the drug. And then another big thing, so it's two topics and you can decide which one you want to do first. Another big thing is, if obesity is one of the major issues we want to tackle, the obesity epidemic is essentially a human-made problem. It's a sociologic problem to a certain degree of our own doing. And it's often quite an American thing to come up with a technologic solution for a sociologic problem. This is like a hack for the entire obesity epidemic. Now, if you don't do it, then people will have obesity, and it might be harder to actually solve the underlying problem. But definitely people can have complicated views on whether it's appropriate to create a problem, and then instead of fixing the thing that caused the problem in the first place, for example, dealing with big food and our whole food supply problem, instead we just come along with a drug after the fact. And so this sort of more existential question of, is it appropriate to be using a drug to solve obesity? And I think the answer is probably yes, but. But those are the two things I'd like to discuss. This notion of using a drug to solve obesity, and if we're going to use the drug, what are we going to do about the fact that even for the indications we have, not all the right people are getting the drug?
Yeah, so you're really saying two things. One is, should we even be using medicines? And what do we do about equity? And, I wish we could fix the problem in other ways. My mother's a chef. I've been a foodie all my life, right? But there's a problem in our society that we just can't stop overeating. And it's a fact that people are overeating. Is it a society-made issue? It's also a genetic by design issue, right? Because we were designed for thousands of years ago to actually have a really hard time finding food and store fat when food was available. So that's the biology is really working against us, right?
Not just us.
No, not just
we've had 35,000 rounds as Homo sapiens, but all of the Earth has been around for 4.5 billion, and nearly all of life is spending its time trying to get energy and food source long enough to procreate.
Yeah, and now we've made this change in society so long, but I wish we could tackle the other dialogues, and how I wish everyone could have a healthy life and they'd have good food in the schools, and we all knew what healthy food was, so you could feel properly satiated and everyone could afford it. But it's just, unfortunately, we don't have that right now. So the medicines are something that can help many people right now, but I don't think they should be the long-term solution. They should maybe be the long-term solution for some people. But if we don't fix the underlying problem where people can live a balanced and healthy life without overeating, not putting blame on everyone, because it's not anybody's fault, right? It's the unfortunate combination of our genetic makeup and the society that we live in. And add on top of that, right, the fact that some people are poor and they don't have the resources. And that's why I really hope the summit can also result in some solutions, right, to the underlying problem. But while that is not in place, we do have these medicines that could actually help a lot of people. And not just with obesity, also other addictions.
So to me, this conference was really an eye-opener, because I didn't really realize that people were seriously talking about, giving about half of the population a GLP-1 agonist to solve the obesity problem. And so this was really, really amazing to me. And because people realized that although it was clear that the obesity was there because people were overeating, this was a problem that you couldn't solve. But you could solve it if you combine lifestyle changes to the extent that it is possible at all with a GLP-1 agonist. And this could be, so this was raising a hope that you could actually do something about it on a really large scale. But that, of course, requires that the prices come down considerably and that the supplies are much, much, much better than they are. So this is out in the future. I do have some comments to that also. But it's really, really interesting. One of the things that, I was trying to hold my hand up all the time during that meeting to put an aspect into this debate that was not put in. That is, why do people get obese? They get obese because they eat too much. Why do they all of a sudden eat more after 1980, as was pointed out several times, this curve? That's because it was the first time in history that people could afford to eat more than they need. Everybody has more money. All the gross national products have risen in these years, and all of that money comes out in society. So the food industry has decided to try to suck up that money, by putting additives to all of these ultra-processed foods, more salt, more sugar, so that people cannot resist them any longer. And they're cheap at the same time because they're mass-produced. That is the true explanation for the obesity. So you cannot really solve that it's not possible to stop the industry completely. You can do some legislation probably, but it's going to be a big, big, big problem. And that's why a solution like the GLP-1 comes into a kind of global perspective, which is really, really interesting. So can you produce enough of it? Yes. It's already being produced. Will the prices come down? Yes, they will come down. In India, they're selling GLP-1s as semaglutide now at 14% of the list price, at really low, just $15 per month. So it has become cheap. It's already happening. So we're looking into this now.
So yes, if we started tomorrow with every government in the world absolutely dedicated to unwinding all of the things that happened to our food production system to get back to 1979 in terms of the total availability of calories, in terms of not exploiting people's genetic predisposition to crave salty, all the things that ultra-processed foods, they're biologic hacks. They're hacking into the way we're programmed genetically. If we started tomorrow with a worldwide effort to roll this back, it would still take a long time. And if it were even successful, it would take a while. And in that time, there would be maybe billions of lost years of life due to people having a shorter lifespan than they would have otherwise had because of obesity. And so I think you or we are suggesting, or the WHO is suggesting, that the broad-scale use of GLP-1 RAs would be a short circuit on that and would give back to humanity tens or hundreds of billions of otherwise lost years of life. So then the issue about availability, I guess one issue is, there's an issue actually of production, as was pointed out by the WHO. You can't actually make enough of this drug, even if you could drop the price. But these are, again, technologic challenges. Presumably, the price will come down as more people enter the market, more producers enter the market, and production will go up. So then, if we came back to somewhere like the United States, where 75% of adults are now thought to be obese, depending on the standard, and so you could think about the majority of Americans going on those drugs. That's still a fairly staggering thing to say out loud. But let's say that were the case. How young would you start? There have been, of course, studies in children, in part because regulatory authorities hold pharma responsible. Do you think it's wise to see these drugs used Should pediatricians be giving these drugs?
So if I may say something, as a person who spent on almost all my career in big pharma, right? I do think we need to be cautious, right? And we do need to really focus on other solutions as well. I don't think we should medicate the whole world. We need to try and get to solve the underlying issue. There were so some of the things I heard at the summit where people were saying, we see people who don't eat anything but chips and drink soda, right? And
Right.
So I had this suggestion that I think it's okay to share here as well. Why don't we, I want to target all the women billionaires in the US, right, to see if you could not kind of bring those together to help children grow up in a healthier world where they learn how to make good food and help people how to do this. To hear that people don't even have a refrigerator or a kitchen, I'm crying, right? Because it's a temporary solution for the people who need it the most, right? And yes, their medicines are approved for long-term use, and they should be used long-term in those that need it, as long as there are no other solutions. But we should work on other solutions as well for such a fundamental problem on how we live happily in society. That would be but to answer to your concrete question, they are approved for children. So if there's no other ways to help people, there shouldn't be any problem with actually using them in adolescents and children.
But right now, we are having a population of obese adolescents and young adults that have a terrible prognosis. They're really facing, and they are already developing diabetes and cardiovascular disease. And so it's a terrible prognosis, and nothing is effective on these individuals. I mean, that has been so disappointing, all the therapeutic attempts that have been made. And now it turns out that the GLP-1s will help them. They can really do this. Right now, they are being operated at ages below 20 with bariatric surgery, which I find much more problematic, that you are making a permanent change in their architecture with a risk of serious complications. Whereas with a GLP-1, you can really solve that problem. And it was demonstrated in a Danish cohort, just a very recent study, that you could really do something for these adolescents with morbid obesity. So it's a fantastic change.
And adolescents with type 2 diabetes. So traditionally, type 1 was called juvenile onset, but of course, many children and youths are getting juvenile onset that's not type 1. They're getting type 2 diabetes. Presumably, they would be excellent candidates for GLP-1 RAs.
Yeah, it's just maybe it's a little bit of a battle of words, Jens, right? You're not solving the problem, right? It's a treatment, and it's not normalizing them, right? So it's just, I would just hate to see us walk away and just say, oh, the medicines are just that's just all we need to do. We need to get to the other problem around how to make the world healthier.
This was definitely also the conclusion of the summit,
Yeah.
That you had to combine these things. You have to do all you can to improve the conditions for people.
If you did only one of the two things, if you fixed the entire issue around food so that children could grow up in an environment where it was much easier to eat healthily, that's a great long-term solution that does very little for the many millions of children who are already incredibly obese and for whom it might be a very hard thing to turn around. GLP-1 RAs represents a very legitimate treatment for those who are already overweight, and it is probably the fastest path to bring them back to having some long-term prognosis that is the one would have always wished for those children. But on the other hand, to rely only on the drugs is beyond sad, because that's giving up on the long-term optimal solution.
Right? Because there you would also suggest that people should, diet and exercise and all that, and to make the whole thing much more effective and much more reasonable.
So Lotte, the floor is open for you to talk a little bit as we wrap up here about the Female Billionaire Club.
Yeah. So when I was at the summit, right, I heard many of the medical doctors who actually see people in their practice talk about what life is out there, right? How poor people are, how few resources they have, how they don't even know which foods, if you give children fruit and vegetables home from the school, they don't know how to cook them or don't even know how to eat some of them, right? So it's a massive investment that would be needed in order to kind of create centers that could help families to actually start off on a healthier future. And there I just couldn't help think about, we always hear about the male tech billionaires. We hear less about the female billionaires. And there's something around children that connects a little bit to motherhood. So I just thought, it could be really interesting to actually see if you had an actual solution to how you could do this, because you need to get to where the people are. How about, trying to see if you could bring together a large enough crowd of the female billionaires to help fund this. And, of course, I use Claude for everything, right? And I had Claude made me a very interesting list of who you could target and what their different uniquenesses are. So I think that could be an interesting idea after JAMA has published its summit report, right? To then actually see how could you set that up.
Well, so I think it's a great idea. And to put it in context, of course, part of the reason probably that you were thinking about these sort of private investment models is because thus far, public efforts, government efforts have been largely unsuccessful. And we heard that from Marion Nestle very compellingly at the start of the summit that
absolutely,
that it's hard for anyone to feel good about the current food supply situation. And yet, even when we have a government that in part has a mandate to try to make America healthy again, it is thus far largely unsuccessful in doing large-scale change to our food production system. And so maybe we absolutely need to look for huge game-changing efforts, such as the ones that Lotte's going to try to convince Oprah and Mackenzie and the other female billionaires to do. And in the meantime, though, much as obesity and the rise in type 2 diabetes is a crushingly awful thing to look at, in part because it feels somewhat human-made, we would be in an even worse situation if we didn't have GLP-1 RAs. They do not represent a solution, but they represent a way to give people back their lives in a way that it's really remarkable. And we wouldn't be here if it wasn't for the two of you. It's really amazing. You've done an incredible service for humanity. It's impressive. So why don't we wrap with asking you each to finish with, what do you see as the biggest challenge on the horizon, and what are you most excited about?
I think the biggest challenge is to make a permanent solution where more people can have a healthy relationship with food and to get that to work at scale. I think that's the biggest challenge. I'm excited about the potential for these GLP-1 medicines to help with even more things, One thing is food addiction, I would call it, right? But there are other kinds of addiction where there's also budding evidence that GLP-1s might work against alcoholism and drug addiction and, gambling addiction, shopping addiction, because it's the same basic biology it touches. And even also depression and anxiety. And so there's so many hypotheses that there are even more things that these medicines could help with. But of course, we don't have the evidence. We need the evidence. There are smaller trials in alcoholism, right? But we need more evidence. So while we're waiting for those other solutions, I think there's a huge opportunity for these medicines to help people live better lives and longer lives.
Well said. Well, that's exciting. Jens?
So, as we already touched upon, back in around 2013, when liraglutide was first shown to have an effect on body weight, which in the little bit larger dose, Novo Nordisk had done a dose response study and found out with a little bit larger dose of 3 milligrams, you could actually do something, produce a good weight loss. And it was approved for obesity therapy. This was the sensation, the great breakthrough, but nobody thought that this was possible in those days. So it was really a kind of a stubborn company that maintained that this was possible. It was not very good, and Saxenda never became a big success. It was only when semaglutide came and caused these 15 to 20% weight losses that the real breakthrough happened. So it happened anyway, even if everybody said it couldn't be done. Everybody said that. No government would pay a penny for this. Nobody would invest money in this. But it did happen. So we were in a completely unexpected situation. It is really a surprising development. And as I said, I was so surprised to learn at this summit that people really thought about this as a solution for the obesity problem, to put in a GLP-1 helper. Let's call it a helper, an additive that actually will support all the other initiatives. And I think this is fantastic. And I'm completely convinced that it will be possible, and it will happen, that there will be a large-scale production of GLP-1 agonists, and that they will be cheap, because it would be foolish not of all the companies on the globe to try to produce these substances. It will be like, the production of toilet paper that everybody needs. And that happens. And you can still make money on producing toilet paper. Not a lot of every roll, but you can still do it. And that will be the same.
That's maybe the most interesting analogy I've heard in a long time.
GLP-1s are like toilet paper, and you can still make money on them. On that note, we should wrap it up. It was great speaking with both of you. Thank you so much for joining the podcast. And thank you for listening to this episode of Healthy Dialogue. I'm Derek Angus, and I have been chatting with Jens Holst and Lotte Knudsen about GLP-1 RAs, or GLP-1s. There is much more to discuss about this topic, so look for future episodes on the subject from us, and for the report from the JAMA Summit on Obesity. This episode was produced by Daniel Morrow, Matthew O'Connor, and myself at the JAMA Network. If you have questions or comments, let us know at healthydialogue@jamanetwork.org, and we'll try to respond in a future episode. To follow this and other JAMA Network podcasts, please visit us online at jamanetworkaudio.com or search Healthy Dialogue wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you for listening.
This content is protected by copyright by the American Medical Association with all rights reserved, including those for text and data mining, AI training, and similar technologies.